Hello, and you're very welcome to another episode of History Now. I'm very honoured and delighted today to be able to bring a very prestigious academic from Birmingham City University to the show, Professor Kehinde Andrews. Professor Andrews is the Professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University and is the author of a number of books. And he's well known for his television appearances across a number of networks across the UK. So it is my tremendous honour to have him in the show today to talk about his new book, The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World. It's a book that is a very sobering read and has caused a lot of stir in the media since it was published just at the beginning of last month. So it's my tremendous honour to welcome Professor Kehinde Andrews to the show. Thank you. Your New Age of Empire, your book New Age of Empire, I think it's a very vital book and it's very sobering, a very sobering read. Can we talk about the origins of the book? Because I know a couple of years ago you did a video for the Guardian newspaper. Can you tell us about that and the reaction that you got from that?
Yeah, so it was a couple of years ago. I was asked to do they do these in my opinion videos, like these short 2-3 minute videos, and they were like, "What do you want to do it about?" So I came up with this idea of the West is built on racism, largely because I think that it's something that we don't really think about. Like it's such an important. I've been so many debates and discussions about class issues and about race as prejudice or race as something secondary that's, you can kind of get over. But actually, race, white supremacy is really the founding stone of the West. Like without white supremacy, we don't have the three great revolutions of science, industry, and politics. Like what makes the West is racism. And then so I wanted to make the video as a quick reminder, and it really is only 2 to 3 minutes, so it was a difficult thing because it's like 400 words. But no, the video went viral. We really did got millions of views, and it kind of sparked a conversation because I think it touched a nerve of what a lot of people have been thinking about.
I watched the video, and lots of people I know watched the video and talked about it. There seems to be, at the present time, there's a number of high-profile academics such as yourself, Priya Gopal, David Olusoga, Dan Hicks, a lot of different people who are challenging in different ways, the preconceived notion of empire, particularly in the UK, but, wider. Do you see that there is, an academic, perhaps movement is the wrong word, but, an academic school of thought that is actively challenging that? And what are the challenges of challenging such a, deeply held notion about empire?
I don't know, because it's not new at all. Like none of these arguments really are that new. We've had, decolonial scholarship for a long time. Activism, Malcolm X is my absolute favorite. The only real difference we have now is one, it's a bit more in the academy. So if you think about what the university is, it's only relatively recently there's been any black and brown people really in the university. And so, I'm one of 0.68% of professors who are black in the UK. So, you have people like Gaminda Bambara, you have there is a I guess a sort of a critical mass. I wouldn't say critical mass. There's a few of us in academia and in some of these more mainstream media. And one of the things that's happened, if you think about social media and the proliferation of news channels and like that, there's more space to hear divergent voices. So I don't think any of this is really new. It's just hitting the mainstream probably now more in a bit of a different way. But I also then don't think it's had that much of an impact more broadly. Even though I guess the idea is more popular, I still think you'd be very well. The reaction that I get most of the time when I go on TV or do anything, it's pretty obvious that the old ideas of empire are still very much entrenched, I think.
So do you think that it's the belief that empire was good and benign and a positive force for good is generational, or do you think there's younger people who still believe that? Sort of what older generations do?
I think the YouGov poll in 2015 was 60% of the population thought that the empire was a force for good. I think it came down a bit to about half. They did a couple of years later, but that's got to include quite a lot of young people for it to be so high. And I think what I'm trying to do in the book is to look. These aren't historical, so I guess you find most, hopefully, with younger people, it wouldn't be controversial to say the empire is not a force for good. I'm not 100% sure. But there's a very different thing to say, look, we're not 100% proud of this. It was a brutally violent history. But then understanding that that's still the present, understanding that those logics still work today, that's a completely different thing, which I actually think is not generational at all. I think we've all kind of, and all when I say all, most of us, it's much more difficult to challenge the fact that that is still with us, that it hasn't gone, it's not in the past.
So your book begins with a comment on the Enlightenment, which is very interesting. You've argued very well and forcefully how the Enlightenment movement, people like Kant and even Charles Darwin, have laid the roots not only for empire, but for continued racial hierarchy. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us a bit about that, a bit of background on the first chapter, and why do people get so defensive when you bring this up about the Enlightenment?
I have to say, I was very surprised because I don't think most people know much about the Enlightenment. And the one time I trended on Twitter was when I was on Newsnight and just pointed out that Immanuel Kant was a racist. Immanuel Kant is a racist. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt. My days is terrible guy. But people got really upset, right? Like a proper upset. And again, most people, I'm going to guess, that got upset had no idea who Immanuel Kant is, which does tell you something. It's telling us that the basic ideas of the Enlightenment, the principles, that when people defend them so vigorously, when they really have very little knowledge of them, they must be absolutely foundational to our understanding. And if you think about the Enlightenment, that movement that starts, it's 17th century, 18th century, that is the basis of all the knowledge that we currently have and use. That is the foundation of science. If you think about scientific understandings, philosophy, history, psychology, that everything goes through the Enlightenment. So it really is really, really, really foundational, which is why people are so quick to defend it. But if you look at the Enlightenment, and before I wrote the book, I knew the general problem. But when you actually get into the specifics, the devil really is in the detail. It's far worse. It's far worse than I thought. All the Enlightenment scholars, all of them, not bar none, agreed with the premise of white supremacy. Most of them had Immanuel Kant is important because he has one of the most influential kind of taxonomies, which has Africa at the bottom, white people at the top. White people are the people who are rational and who are thinking and who have all the talents, and black people are savage, etc., etc. And Kant's interesting because he moves from actually giving instructions to slave owners of how best to be African based on his dubious racial theory, to by the end of his life, and it really is the very end, he comes out against slavery, comes out against colonialism. And this is somehow used to say he changed his mind, wasn't it great? But if you actually look at the logic of his reasoning, it's in the same way that we don't think you should be cruel to apes, right? Like you can believe the apes have the right to the life, the apes shouldn't be enslaved, whatever, but you don't believe they're really human. And unfortunately, that kind of model of rights is the model of rights that we currently have today. Deeply white supremacist, but pretends it's something else.
I know a little bit. I studied a bit of the Enlightenment at university, but one of the things that surprised me is, in a way, was what you looked at in relation to Charles Darwin, because I think Darwin is one of these Enlightenment figures that people who don't know about the Enlightenment know about, and they have this idea of a benign grandfather type figure. Could you tell us how he features in your book?
Yeah. Well, social Darwinism is one of if you think about that, the kind of what leads to how you get Nazi Germany, social Darwinism is one of the key, right? This idea of evolution. And Darwin's this recent quote from Darwin, openly racist, openly believed in hierarchies and that, evolution and this idea of evolution, and what there is a debate at the time is whether we are one species, as one human species, the monogenesis, which is Darwin, or whether we're there's multiple species. So Africans are actually a different species completely, the polygenesis. And Darwin is kind of the monogenesis in chief, right? He believes he's the one, evolution, we all evolved, etc. But really clearly in the idea is that on the scale of evolution, Africa is at the bottom and white is at the top. And actually, if you think about I think I have this quote in the book, where I say, we think about this link, the look for searching for the missing link, because always searching for the missing link. I mean, it really was literally like which African tribe most closely resembled monkeys. They could then say this is the link where monkeys changed to man. But Darwin's ideas are absolutely essential to that, and not just the ideas, but he himself was deeply racist and deeply believed this idea of white supremacy.
So I want to talk about the links to slavery in society. Mostly you're looking at British society, but it's not all to do with British society. But I think this has come to the fore, in the last number of years about how financial institutions, even church institutions, had links to slavery. Can you tell us about that in your book? And, probably a follow-up question to that is, when you were researching the book, did any of it come as a surprise or shock to you? Because it certainly did to me, and, it shows how embedded a lot of the institutions that people take for granted were in the slave trade.
Well, I mean, the church, not surprising at all. I think, probably the detail, again, always the detail is kind of a thing. But I think if you think about what is the first justification for racism before you have the Enlightenment and before you have science, it really is religion. Religion is the thing, right? That Africans and white people are closer to God. And you see, actually, the Bible's, even before you really have racial formation, dark and light, etc. And this really gets put on the body, and we're not supposed to have souls, so we're savages. And it really is Christians and the Catholic Church in particular, which justifies the enslavement of Africans very clearly. So there's a very clear intellectual link. Just going back a second to the Enlightenment, one of the things we're promised with the Enlightenment is that it gets rid of the old religious explanations. And the race, it actually made it worse, right? Took that and then put it on the body, put it in genetics. And then if you think about the first slave ship that John Hawkins sold, not the first slave ship, but the Queen Elizabeth kind of launches England, I should say, into the slave trade on a ship called Jesus, which should just tell you everything you need to know, really. And the church is one of the major slave owners, actually, plantation owners on the Caribbean. And when there was this reparations was paid after slavery, to abolish slavery in the British Empire, they paid money to slave owners. The church is one of the biggest beneficiaries. Church, both in theory and in practice, absolutely embedded into slavery and slave trade.
You focus on a few of the well-known financial institutions. How have they, once this sort of, use the modern words, PR disaster, is brought to their door, how have they reacted?
Well, I think the response of the financial institutions has been abhorrent, would be the best way to put it. I mean, you have, if you think about insurance, you think about finance, capitalism, so much of it can't happen without the Atlantic system. It's not just the slave trade, it's the wealth from the slave trade, is where that goes. The wealth from the slave trade is put into colonialism, it's put into factories, it's put into everything we have, right? Think about just basic products like insurance. Where did it get its become embedded and really part of the system? Slavery, enslaved ships, and slave health insurance. It was health insurance on slave plantations, life insurance, these kind of things. These we kind of now take for granted really get their root there. Now, really importantly, this isn't past wealth. That wealth is accumulated. That wealth is generated. That wealth founds these companies. They then build on that wealth, and it's not a coincidence that the insurance companies are some of the richest companies in the world today. And the best example is Lloyd's of London, which is Britain's largest financial institution, multi-billion, it's like 40 billion, 50, some crazy number. But where did it start from? Even before it was insuring slave ships, which is what its first business model was, it was a coffee house in London where you would return runaway slaves. I mean, it's just a terrible institution which it owes all of its existence to first slavery. And then remember, it's not like after slavery ends, it's all happy and good. We have a global financial order which exploits resources, wealth, labor from what we would have called the third world. And companies like Lloyd's of London are deeply, deeply embedded in that practice as well. So for a company like that to come out and say, we want, what do they say they're going to do? Their apology and their reparations looks like a diversity scheme and giving some money to charity. But that's offensive. That's actually offensive. Lloyd specifically has been sued in the US courts at least twice for reparations, and always, up until now, denied any culpability, right? But now it's PR, it's good for business. They're happy to kind of wave this reparations flag. Honestly, I think it's the most offensive part of what's happened over the summer.
And your book, of course, the follow-up chapter to slavery looks at colonization, and suppose what could be termed the first phase of colonization, which is, physical presence in, different countries, of people of brown and black skin. Now, what your book does show very well is how, these countries and these people were exploited for their manpower, their natural resources. But what's really interesting, and I suppose leads on to later phases of colonization, is the underinvestment in the likes of education, of healthcare, of things like that, that leaves people, once the countries are so-called decolonization, leaves the native peoples of these countries in a state of dependency. Could you perhaps tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, that's the key thing with colonialism. One, it is the exploitation, but it is this what Walter Rodney calls the underdevelopment. So when Britain colonizes large parts of Africa, it's not building schools, it's not building roads, it's not building hospitals, it's not building anything the country needs. Everything's built to extract, right? So when Britain leaves a place like Ghana in 1956, there's no possible way that Ghana can function as a state because it doesn't have enough schools, hospitals, roads. It doesn't have any way. All of its if you actually think about the key resources of someone like Ghana, all of those are still in control of Western organizations. So the businesses and the corporations which were there before are still there, and they're still extracting wealth. So you have a country that doesn't control its wealth, can't educate its people, can't give healthcare to its people, has no resources. Of course, it's going to be dependent on the West. Like, there's no way. That's always going to be the case, right? So when these countries then fall into dependency, have to take loans from like the IMF, World Bank, Development Agency, and then that's basically a tool to control them from outside. But that's by design. That's not because of corruption or because the countries are failing. That's because they were set up to be dependent, and that dependency has been maintained to today.
And if we can, go on to this, perhaps what's called the second phase of colonization. Now, I want to just say something to set this up. I was watching recently an interview with Gore Vidal, towards the end of his life, where he talks about, when it comes up to this phase of decolonization, you've got FDR in the White House. Gore argued that he deplored, the British Empire, the Dutch Empire, the French colonial empire, but had designs in picking up the pieces for the US. But what he argues is that America did have an empire, but it only lasted for 5 years after World War II to 1950. Your book, you show that through these financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, that's not the case. It's just a different way of, working an empire. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, 100%. So what happens in the first version of empire is violence. You need this violence. You need to kill people. You need to control people. You need to have colonial. You have to literally control to take the resources out. After the Second World War, this becomes less possible because European empires have less money, right? They're broke. Like Britain's broke. It's very difficult to manage the empire. But bigger than that, you have resistance. People are resisting. They're rebelling. Also, one of the things we tend to forget about the World War is it was a world war and the colonial people were involved in a world war and they have just picked up arms to fight. It's very difficult to then go back to them and say, we're going to control you with violence, right? So basically, that kind of first version runs its course. It can't hold anymore. But America's there. Remember, America is just Europe on steroids, right? It's like an extension of Europe. There's lots of Europeans went to a place and just acted with complete barbarity and built this. It's not a coincidence that America is the richest country in the world, right? But it's essentially an extension of Europe. You shouldn't see America as anything else other than an extension of Europe. And there is this, they see the opportunity to say, well, we can still keep the same mechanism, right? You can still exploit the resources. We can still exploit the labor. And we don't need to do the violence anymore. Well, that's not 100% true. There's lots of examples of the kind of old school colonial violence. But there's a very clear shift where it becomes a financial regime, where it is about the IMF, it is about the World Bank. It is about even the UN and aid agencies where, and it's even worse because you're pretending you're a friend, right? You say, well, look, we've made you poor. We've taken all your resources. We still take all your resources, by the way, we're still making you poor, but we'll give you a helping hand. We'll give you this loan. And then with those loans come these strings attached. We say that you have to stay in this financial regime. You have to have austerity. You have to have be open to foreign direct investment. You have to be part of we have to let us keep leeching from you. And so that's what keeps people stuck in this thing. And it's in many ways, it's actually worse because we don't see it for what it is. We rather than looking at actually this is a problem of the West taking resources, labor, etc., we're actually now blaming the countries for bad governance or corruption. And there is a lot of corruption, don't get me wrong, but that corruption that's part of the Western system, right? That's nothing African about the corruption or in the developed world about the corruption. That's built into how these systems are maintained. So it's actually I'd actually argue this version of empire is actually worse than the previous one, because at least with the previous one, we all knew it was bad and we all knew what we were against.
I just want to pick up on that, what you said there, that people don't see it for a problem. And there's an interesting quote, and I'm going to read from the quote in your book, You say it's perverse to celebrate the marginal gains of the underdeveloped world after genocide, slavery, and colonialism has produced this racially unjust social order. Now, people today, rightly, you say that they don't recognize that. Is that down to, for want of a better term, extremely good PR on these countries who are operating this sort of slick regime and financial model on these former colonies?
Yes, certainly is partly his PR, and a big part of it is if you think about the role of religion that was so important in terms of pacifying people and it wasn't just enough to go. You couldn't just go in and kill everybody. You had to pacify them with something. And this is why you find that Black people love Christianity, right? Like in a big way, because it's really been instilled in as a way of teaching the savages, etc. We kind of picked up some of those. There's a kind of colonial mentality. And if you think about what the education system is or the school system is, this is the same thing, right? Where is it that the leaders of these countries get their education? From the West, right? They're going to British institutions, American institutions, learning about development, which doesn't talk about race, learning about the Washington Consensus, the idea of austerity, basically, is the way they're being trained into this, right? If you look at the media and the domination of the media about how these images have fixed them, what it is you want to get and what it is you want to achieve and where we're trying to go. That brainwashing, we call it brainwashing, that colonial, it is brainwashing. That colonial brainwashing has always been essentially in the first part, and it's equally essential now, where this is why the education part is really, 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 really important. And I always say to people, if you are from the underdeveloped world, the last thing you should do is come and study development studies in a Western institution, because you are literally learning how to destroy your country. That's the point of it. But that, unfortunately, that is hegemonic, I guess is the word.
You do focus on the British Empire, but other empires, other European empires. But interestingly, you look at a non-Western empire in China and its role in Africa today. Could you give us a bit of background on their role in Africa?
Yeah, so China is is a perfect example of everything we just spoke about, right? So China is the new emerging superpower, will at some point have the largest economy. But again, where's China? How has this happened? We have to remember that China's role in Africa from Second World War to the death of Mao is largely as an ally, right? China is communist. China is supporting revolutionary struggles. There really is no armed struggle in Africa without China and Chinese weapons and Chinese support. Black Panthers would go to China. China was very much, let's overturn the West, right? And you can see that in Vietnam, etc. But Mao's dead, right? And Mao's China is also dead. Like, this no longer exists. We need to stop holding on to that myth, because China makes a very clear decision in '76 to switch and to say, actually, no, we can't beat the West. We're going to have to join the West and become part of the West. And it does that by essentially becoming the workshop of the world, right? So many things are produced in China for the West. Remember, the money from this comes from the West. It's not separate. It's not outside. It's a really important part of capitalist production. But because China's growing now, it's still using the same logic. And it does this in two ways. So one of them is, why is it that everything's made in China? Because the standard of living in China is so low that they can pay sweatshop labor. That's racism, right? We're literally saying, China has 1 billion people, 400 million of which live in absolute poverty that we would never accept here. So that whole model depends on racial exploitation of Chinese workers. The fact there are some people in China getting rich off this does not change the logic, right? And then the second thing is, Africa in particular, is where do you get the resources to be the workshop of the world? You have to go to the same place as Europe went to, and that's Africa, right? And it's also not coincidental that since China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001 or 2, their trade to Africa was literally went up by 20 times in 10 years, because through that mechanism, they're doing exactly the same thing that Europe does, which is take out the resources for pittance, turn them into products, and make lots and lots and lots and lots of profit. And so China's influence in Africa at every level has been terrible and has really damaged the political economy, deindustrialized. I mean, if you think about textile manufacturing, properly deindustrialized and impoverishing Africa in the short term, but really impoverishing Africa in the long term. There's nothing new about China. It's just following the Western model.
I have to say, for someone who's very interested in Malcolm X, I really, find the title of the last chapter very apt. Chickens Coming Home to Roost. In that you address how neoliberalism is impacting upon Britain, and how ultimately, the immigrants who came from those former colonies are bearing the brunt of that. You've a very good sort of study about how the language of racism is used in this context. Could you tell us what you mean about the chickens coming home to roost?
Well, so what you have is, if you think about everything that we currently complain about in the West, privatization, this austerity agenda, all this stuff about the corruption we've got with the track and trace, with 37 billion to his friends, it didn't even work, right? Like, that all happened in the developing world, but that is exactly this has just happened later here, but that is essentially the Washington consensus, which has been offered to underdeveloped world for years. So we're seeing that same logic now being applied here, and we're going, oh, well, it's crazy, it's terrible, etc. Right? So that's a very clear example of chickens coming home to roost. Once you set something in motion, it's very difficult to stop the blowback. What did Césaire called it, the boomerang effect that you have when fascism comes into Europe. And it's exactly, neoliberalism is the same thing, boomerang effect. And the second part would be immigration. Everybody's anti-immigration, but why am I here? I'm here because my family was taken in slavery to the Caribbean. And then not only that, because Jamaica was so impoverished and remains so impoverished, of course we're going to move here. Like, where else are we going to go? We've basically created this massive, this huge distinction in wealth, where we talk about class. The biggest thing, class distinction, is whether you are born in the West or whether you are not born in the West. That's the biggest one. That will determine so many things. Where most people in the world don't have a toilet in their house. 9 million people die from hunger every year. The conditions are so different. And then we wonder why people want to come to the West. Of course they want to come to the West, because why will you have to, because the countries are being so impoverished. So all these issues that we're having here and complaining about, that's the chickens coming home to roost. This is what happens when you go and do this to the rest of the world. And it's also a reminder that all empires fall, and usually they fall under their own contradictions. And I think you can see the contradictions coming, they're all coming together now.
The book, it's a fascinating read, and it's a very uncomfortable read. And I think that's important, that it is an uncomfortable read. So what's the reaction been like for the book?
It's been, well, okay, it's two reactions. So one, the right-wing press, they hate it, oh my God, or love it. One of the two, I don't know. There's been a lot of hit pieces in the New Statesman, even Standard, other ones, I don't know. There's been a lot of kind of like, oh, this book is just, which is fine. I get that. I was kind of want that as well to some extent. But generally, it's been quite an openness to the ideas and the idea of discomfort. I think people do. I don't know, because I think one of the things which we need now is to be uncomfortable. And there's so much stuff about race and books you read about, and they just end them, and you will feel happy at the end. That's the worst possible thing. But honestly, we need to be uncomfortable. And so far, I think people have engaged quite well and kind of engaged the idea of discomfort. That is the emotional.
As I say, I love the book. It made me feel very uncomfortable, and I'm happy it made me feel uncomfortable. Can you tell our viewers where it's available from?
Yeah, get it from anywhere, all good bookstores, and audio as well. So I actually recorded the audio version in my house under a sheet for like 3 days, which was interesting. But definitely, yeah, anywhere you can get books.
Professor Andrews, thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.